What if the deadliest disaster in aviation history was not an accident but an assassination? Not of a person, but of an entire technology. What if the Hindenburg explosion was deliberately engineered to destroy public confidence in airships, clearing the way for heavier-than-air aviation that would consume vastly more fuel, generate enormous profits for oil companies, and ensure that air travel remained expensive and controlled rather than becoming accessible to ordinary people? In 1937, airships dominated long-distance air travel. They were superior to airplanes in almost every measurable way. Safer, more efficient, more comfortable, more economical. The technology was mature, proven, and advancing rapidly. Companies were planning global airship networks. Engineers were designing larger, more capable craft. The future of aviation was clearly lighter than air. Then, on May 6, 1937, the Hindenburg burst into flames while landing in Lakehurst, New Jersey. 37 seconds. That is how long it took for the largest airship ever built to be consumed by fire. 36 people died. And in the aftermath, in the shock and horror broadcast to millions through newsreels and radio, the entire airship industry collapsed. Not gradually. Not through careful re-evaluation. Instantly. As if the disaster had been designed not just to destroy one airship but to kill the technology itself. Within months, all major airship programs were cancelled. Existing ships were grounded and scrapped. Routes were abandoned. Infrastructure was dismantled. And heavier-than-air aviation, which had killed far more people and showed far worse safety records, was suddenly promoted as the only viable future for air travel. Oil companies, airplane manufacturers, and governments that had fought to suppress airship development celebrated quietly while publicly mourning the tragedy. The Hindenburg did not just burn. It was burned. And with it, humanity's chance at efficient, accessible, clean air transportation was incinerated before it could threaten the profits and control of industries that required us to remain dependent on expensive fuel-guzzling alternatives. Let us begin with what airships actually were, because popular understanding has been deliberately distorted. Modern people think of airships as primitive, dangerous, obsolete. We imagine vast flammable balloons, doomed dinosaurs of aviation, technological dead ends. But this perception is manufactured. It is the result of decades of propaganda designed to justify the suppression of a technology that was, in many ways, superior to what replaced it. Airships are lighter than aircraft. They achieve lift through buoyancy, using gas that is lighter than air, hydrogen or helium, contained in a rigid framework or flexible envelope. They require minimal fuel because they do not fight gravity. They simply float. Propulsion is needed only for forward motion and maneuvering, not to stay aloft. This makes them extraordinarily fuel-efficient compared to airplanes, which must generate constant thrust to maintain altitude. The Graf Zeppelin, which operated from 1928 to 1937, flew over 1 million miles carrying thousands of passengers without a single fatality. It crossed the Atlantic, circumnavigated the globe, operated scheduled passenger service between Europe and South America. Its safety record exceeded that of contemporary airplanes by orders of magnitude. Passengers flew in comfort, in spacious cabins with sleeping berths, dining rooms, observation decks. Travel was smooth, quiet, luxurious. The experience resembled an ocean liner more than an airplane. This was not primitive technology. This was advanced, proven, safe transportation. Airship cargo capacity also exceeded airplanes. A large airship could carry tens of tons of payload across oceans. Airplanes of the era could barely carry their own fuel for such distances, let alone significant cargo. For intercontinental transport of goods, airships were unmatched. Plans existed for airship cargo routes that would have revolutionized global trade, making it faster than ships and far cheaper than airplanes. The fuel efficiency was the most threatening aspect. An airship crossing the Atlantic consumed a fraction of the fuel an airplane required for the same journey. Some designs were exploring hybrid systems using atmospheric electricity to power propulsion, potentially eliminating fuel requirements entirely. If airships had continued developing, if the technology had matured as projected, air travel would have become affordable for ordinary people. Personal airships were being designed. Small craft that families could own and operate. The democratization of flight. And that was unacceptable to industries that profited from scarcity and dependence. Now we must examine the Hindenburg disaster itself, because the official explanation does not withstand scrutiny. We are told that static electricity ignited hydrogen leaking from a ruptured gas cell, and the resulting fire consumed the ship in seconds. But witnesses, physical evidence, and the behavior of the fire all contradict this simple narrative. Multiple eyewitnesses reported seeing flames on the outer surface of the ship before the main explosion. The fire started on the outside, not inside the gas cells. This is critical. If hydrogen was leaking and ignited, the fire would begin internally and burn outward. But witnesses described fire appearing on the fabric skin, spreading across the surface, then penetrating inward. This suggests the fabric itself was burning, not escaping hydrogen. The fabric coating is also suspicious. The Hindenburg's outer skin was treated with a compound containing iron oxide and aluminum powder. This combination is thermite, a highly flammable, intensely hot burning material used in incendiary devices. Why would anyone coat an airship designed to carry flammable hydrogen with a substance that burns at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees? Official explanations claim the coating was for waterproofing and UV protection. But alternative non-flammable coatings existed. The decision to use thermite-like materials on a hydrogen airship makes sense only if someone wanted to ensure it would burn spectacularly. The speed of the fire is also inconsistent with hydrogen combustion alone. Hydrogen burns rapidly but also dissipates quickly, rising immediately due to its lightness. A hydrogen fire in an airship should burn upward and outward, allowing the framework to collapse slowly as gas cells rupture sequentially. But the Hindenburg was consumed in 37 seconds. The entire structure engulfed simultaneously. Multiple witnesses reported fires in different sections at nearly the same moment. This suggests multiple ignition points, not a single spark spreading through leaked gas. This is the signature of deliberate sabotage, not accident. Investigations were suspiciously brief and conclusive. Within weeks, official reports declared the cause was static electricity igniting hydrogen. Alternative theories were dismissed. Evidence was not preserved for independent analysis. The wreckage was quickly cut up and removed. Investigators with conflicts of interest, connections to heavier-than-air aviation companies and oil industry, dominated the inquiry. The conclusion was predetermined. The narrative was controlled. And anyone who questioned it was marginalized. Some witnesses reported seeing a flash of light near the tail of the ship moments before the fire erupted. This could indicate a timed incendiary device. Others reported hearing sounds inconsistent with hydrogen ignition, sharp cracks, like small explosions, before the main fire. Crew members mentioned unusual observations during the final approach, irregularities in handling that suggested external interference. These testimonies were suppressed, dismissed as unreliable, excluded from official reports. Even the circumstances of the landing were suspicious. The Hindenburg was delayed in landing due to weather. It circled for hours, consuming fuel, waiting for clearance. Then, as it finally approached the mooring mast, as cameras recorded and crowds watched, it exploded in the most public, most documented, most dramatic display possible. If the goal was to destroy public confidence in airships, if the objective was to create maximum psychological impact, the timing and setting could not have been better planned. Now we must ask who benefited from the airship industry's destruction. The answer is obvious once we follow the money and the strategic interests, that aligned against lighter-than-air technology. Oil companies benefited enormously. Airships required minimal fuel. Airplanes consumed vast quantities. As aviation expanded in the decades following the Hindenburg, fuel demand skyrocketed. Airlines became major oil consumers. Airports required petroleum for ground operations. The entire infrastructure of heavier-than-air aviation was built on oil dependence. If airships had dominated, if fuel-efficient lighter-than-air craft had become the standard, oil consumption for aviation would have remained a fraction of what it became. The projected profits from aviation fuel were enormous, and airships threatened them. Airplane manufacturers also gained. In the 1930s, the aviation industry was fragmented. Multiple competing technologies. Uncertainty about which would dominate. Airship companies were well-funded, technically advanced, and gaining market share. If airships had continued, airplane manufacturers would have faced fierce competition from a superior technology. But with airships eliminated, airplane companies captured the entire market. Government contracts, commercial routes, military applications, all went to heavier-than-air craft. The elimination of airship competition allowed airplane manufacturers to monopolize aviation. Military interests preferred airplanes. Airships were vulnerable to attack, too large and slow to be effective in combat despite early military use. Airplanes could be weaponized more easily. The coming war, which strategic planners already anticipated, would require vast fleets of bombers and fighters. Airships could not serve these purposes. Governments wanted aviation technology that supported military applications. Eliminating airships and concentrating development on airplanes ensured that civilian aviation infrastructure would be compatible with military needs. Governments also preferred the control that expensive aviation provided. Airships, especially smaller personal craft, would have democratized air travel. If individuals could own and operate personal airships as easily as they owned cars, movement would become difficult to regulate. People could travel without dependence on commercial airlines, without using controlled airports, without submitting to governmental oversight. But expensive airplane travel required infrastructure, airports, fueling systems, maintenance facilities, that could be monitored, regulated, and controlled. Airships threatened this control. Airplanes preserved it. The timing is also revealing. The 1930s were a period of rapid consolidation of industrial power. Monopolies were forming. Competition was being eliminated through both market forces and strategic sabotage. The airship industry was fragmented, German companies, American companies, British companies all competing. But the airplane industry was consolidating with government support. Eliminating airships removed competition and accelerated the formation of aviation monopolies that would dominate for the next century. After the Hindenburg, airship advocates tried to continue. The Graf Zeppelin was still operational. Plans existed for helium airships that would eliminate fire risk. Engineers insisted the technology was sound and could be made even safer. But they were denied funding, denied support, denied permission to operate. The industry was strangled. Not through market failure but through deliberate suppression. Insurance companies suddenly refused to cover airships. Governments revoked operating licenses. Public sentiment, traumatized by the Hindenburg newsreels, turned against the technology. And quietly, behind the scenes, airplane manufacturers and oil companies celebrated the elimination of their greatest threat. Now we must examine what was lost when airships were killed, because the consequences extend beyond transportation. Airship technology represented a different approach to engineering, one based on working with natural forces rather than fighting them. This philosophy, if it had been allowed to develop, could have transformed multiple industries. Airships do not fight gravity. They use buoyancy. This principle, applied broadly, suggests technologies that work with natural forces, atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, electromagnetic fields, rather than brute force solutions that consume massive energy. If airship thinking had dominated engineering culture, we might have developed atmospheric energy harvesting, lighter-than-air cargo transport, stratospheric platforms for telecommunications, and systems that exploit natural buoyancy for industrial lifting. Instead, we developed technologies based on overwhelming force, combustion engines, rockets, jet turbines, that require enormous fuel and generate massive waste. The efficiency lost is staggering. Modern cargo planes consume tens of thousands of gallons of fuel to move freight across oceans. Airships could have done the same with a fraction of the fuel, especially with hybrid systems using atmospheric electricity. The environmental impact alone is significant. But more importantly, the economic impact shaped the 20th century. Cheap air transport could have transformed global trade, made international travel accessible to ordinary people, connected remote regions without expensive infrastructure. Instead, aviation remained expensive, exclusive, and dependent on fossil fuels. Personal airships represented the greatest loss. In the 1920s and early 30s, inventors were designing small airships for private use. Craft that a family could own and operate. Simple, safe, affordable. The flying car dream could have been realized through lighter-than-air technology far more easily than through airplanes. But that dream died with the Hindenburg. Personal airships vanished from public consciousness. And the idea that ordinary people could own aircraft capable of intercontinental travel was replaced by the reality of dependence on commercial airlines and government-controlled airports. The suppression of helium development is also revealing. Helium is non-flammable. Airships filled with helium cannot burn. The United States had near monopoly on helium production in the 1930s. If the Hindenburg disaster had been genuinely about safety, the obvious solution was to mandate helium for all airships. Technology existed. Resources existed. But instead, airships were banned entirely. Why? Because safety was not the real concern. Control was. And airships, even safe helium-filled airships, threatened the control that oil-dependent airplane travel provided. Some researchers suggest that airship technology connected to even older suppressed knowledge. That the principles of lighter-than-air flight were understood by previous civilizations. That Tartarian structures included antenna towers and architectural elements designed to interact with atmospheric electricity in ways that could have powered airship propulsion without fuel. If airships had continued developing, if atmospheric energy research had progressed, connections might have been made to older technologies. Questions might have been asked about why certain architectural features existed, what purposes they served, whether they were components of an atmospheric energy system that once powered a global lighter-than-air transportation network. This is speculative, but the patterns fit. Suppression of airships aligns with suppression of atmospheric energy research. Both technologies threatened oil dependency. Both suggested alternatives to centralized fuel-based systems. Both were eliminated at roughly the same historical moment, the late 1930s, when industrial consolidation and control systems were being finalized before the coming war. The Hindenburg was not just the death of one airship, or even one technology. It was the closing of a door. A deliberate choice to pursue a future based on fuel consumption, environmental destruction, and centralized control rather than efficiency, sustainability, and distributed access. Now we must confront how the narrative has been maintained for 87 years. How has the official story of the Hindenburg persisted despite evidence of sabotage, despite the illogic of abandoning an entire technology based on a single incident, despite the obvious beneficiaries of airship suppression? The answer is psychological manipulation and institutional control of information. The Hindenburg disaster was one of the first major events captured on film and broadcast widely through newsreels. The image of the burning airship, the audio of the reporter's emotional reaction, the horror and spectacle, these created a psychological trauma that bypassed rational analysis. People saw the explosion. They heard the screams. They felt the terror. And that emotional imprint became permanent. Any mention of airships triggered the memory. Any suggestion that airships could be safe was overridden by visceral fear. This is trauma-based psychological conditioning. The same technique used in other contexts to control populations through fear. Create a traumatic event. Ensure it is widely witnessed. Associate it permanently with a technology, ideology, or group. Then exploit the conditioned response to shape behavior. The Hindenburg disaster conditioned generations to fear airships irrationally, making it impossible to revive the technology even when safety improvements made it viable. Educational systems reinforced this conditioning. Textbooks presented airships as historical curiosities, primitive early attempts at flight that were superseded by superior airplane technology. The narrative of inevitable progress, from flawed early attempts to perfected modern solutions, is applied to airship history. Students are taught that airships failed because they were inferior, not because they were suppressed. The technological superiority, the better safety record, the efficiency advantages, these are never mentioned. The story is simplified into disaster and obsolescence. Media continues the conditioning. Whenever airships are depicted in films, documentaries, or popular culture, the Hindenburg is shown. The explosion is replayed. The narrative is reinforced. Modern attempts to revive airship technology are presented as eccentric curiosities, not serious alternatives. Journalists cover airship development with skepticism, always referencing the Hindenburg, always implying that the technology is inherently flawed. The psychological conditioning is so complete that even people who intellectually understand airship advantages cannot shake the visceral association with burning disaster. Industry opposition remains fierce. Modern attempts to develop cargo airships, surveillance airships, or passenger airships face regulatory obstacles far exceeding those imposed on airplanes. Certification requirements are stricter. Insurance costs are prohibitive. Governments deny operating permissions. These barriers are not based on objective safety analysis. Modern airship designs using helium, advanced materials, and computer control are safer than historical craft and safer than many airplane operations. But the suppression continues because the same interests that killed airships in the 1930s still profit from their absence. The few airship projects that have proceeded faced sabotage, or mysterious failures. Prototypes destroyed in suspicious accidents. Funding suddenly withdrawn. Personnel dying in unlikely circumstances. The pattern resembles what happened to Tesla's wireless energy projects, to other suppressed technologies that threatened established industries. The message is clear: airships are not welcome. The technology must remain dormant. And any serious attempt to revive it will be crushed. But knowledge of what was lost survives in archives, in engineering journals, in the testimony of those who worked on airships before the suppression. The Graf Zeppelin's perfect safety record is documented. The fuel efficiency calculations exist. The plans for advanced designs are preserved. And slowly, researchers are recovering this information, analyzing it, recognizing that airship technology was not primitive but sophisticated, not failed but murdered. When we examine the Hindenburg disaster through the lens of who benefited, when we trace the money to oil companies and airplane manufacturers, when we recognize the pattern of suppression that followed, when we see how the narrative has been maintained through psychological conditioning and institutional control, the conclusion becomes undeniable. The Hindenburg was not destroyed by accident. It was sabotaged. Deliberately burned in a spectacular public disaster designed to kill not just one airship but the entire technology. And it worked. The age of airships ended overnight. And the beneficiaries, oil companies, airplane monopolies, control-oriented governments, built a century of profit and power on the ashes. We live in a world shaped by this suppression. A world where air travel consumes vast quantities of fuel, generates massive pollution, remains expensive and exclusive. A world where the skies are controlled by corporations and governments, where personal aircraft are luxury fantasies, where efficient atmospheric transportation was sacrificed for profits. The Hindenburg burned for 37 seconds. But the consequences of that fire have lasted nearly 90 years. And they will continue until we recognize what was taken from us and demand its return. The airships could fly again. The technology exists. The materials are available. Helium is safe. Modern designs are superior to anything that existed in the 1930s. The only barrier is will. The will to challenge industries that profit from inefficiency. The will to confront governments that prefer control over freedom. The will to overcome psychological conditioning and see past the burning image seared into cultural memory. The Hindenburg disaster was a crime. Not just against the 36 people who died. Against humanity. Against the future we could have had. Against the clean, efficient, accessible air travel that was stolen from us by those who needed us dependent, controlled, and consuming. They burned the Hindenburg. But they could not burn the truth. The evidence survives. The records exist. The alternatives are still possible. And the question is whether we will continue accepting the world they built on that burning wreckage, or whether we will recognize that the age of airships did not end because the technology failed. It ended because the technology succeeded too well, threatened the wrong people, and had to be destroyed before it could liberate us from the fuel-dependent, expensive, controlled system that profits from our dependence. The skies are still there. The principles of buoyancy have not changed. The atmosphere still supports lighter-than-air flight as efficiently as it did in 1937. Only the will to use it has been suppressed. And suppression, once recognized, can be overcome. The question is whether we have the courage to look past the burning airship, to see through the propaganda, to recognize what was stolen, and to reclaim what should never have been taken. The age of airships ended overnight. But it does not have to stay ended. Unless we allow fear, carefully cultivated and deliberately maintained, to keep us grounded in a reality designed not for our benefit but for the profit and control of those who burned our future before it could take flight.